Good evening and welcome to Front and Center, where we here at the Center for Syncretic Studies get together to rip apart, discuss, chat over a particular topic that is interesting to us. Tonight, the big one, a big question a lot of people have: what does Russia want, especially in terms of foreign policy? What do those Ruskies want? And with me tonight is Joaquin Flores. Hello, Joaquin.
How are you doing tonight, Tim?
I'm good, and I'm Tim Kirby. I maybe forgot to mention that. But one thing I got to say is that a lot of times, as someone who lives in Russia and works in analysis within Russia, that's a big question that often comes to me is, so what is Russia trying to do? What do they want?
Right.
But I don't think that there's really anyone that monolithic. Is there really any nation where everyone there wants one specific objective?
That's a very good question. So I'm here in Belgrade. You're there in Moscow, and Serbia is another country where people often ask, and they're very, very concerned here in Serbia about what exactly Moscow's foreign policy objectives are, particularly with regard to the Balkans, which, as you know, is quite the powder keg, both today and in recent history, and really in the history of the 20th century. So Serbians, of course, as you know, have a very strong affinity to Russians, and they're people who like each other very much. And in fact, some have commented that there are probably no two people who like each other as much as Russians and Serbians. Myself not being Serbian, I sort of don't have a dog in that race, looking at the question from the very beginning, 6 or 7 years ago when I began to explore this. And so it wasn't something I needed to see or wanted to see. But I really spent a lot of time involved in social movements, consulting political parties, and polling the general public, being in conversations, having a beer at the bar, and just sort of getting the common man's perspective in that. And one thing that's very clear is that here in the Balkans, especially in Serbia, Russia's foreign policy, which way it's going, is a very, very big question. And I know a lot of our readers at Fort Roos News also ask this question a lot. And of course, I think that there's a lot of reasons to think and to follow up on the way you phrase it, I think is really quite apt. Russian society, or power in Russian society, is composed, as you know, of what Russians term the different pillars of Russian society. And these different pillars don't always have the same interests.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing is, there's also different views because if we go from the man on the street, pretty much all over the world, people want to be left alone and want peace because us grunts at the bottom are the ones who have to fight wars. But really, most specifically, I would say that average Russians, maybe it's the legacy of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, but Russians really want respect and want to be considered to be equal to any other big country like China or America, and have the same achievements, the same amount of respect on the international stage, and be basically spoken to as equals, as peers. I think if that's what guy on the street wants, he may not say it that way, but that's more what I get from the feeling of them. So from them.
Well, what we get over here in Serbia, because we have, like Russia, we have a state which seems to be going in one direction, but it is an open society. So like in Russia, there's just tremendous freedoms for the press, for opposition parties. And so that means that what a lot of people get are actually a lot of different points of views. And a lot of those are ones that are very scientifically and heavily orchestrated, coming from Western powers and Western governments. And these don't come by accident. And so as a result, a lot of times the things that Russia does can get spinned in a different way and can be misunderstood. Or conversely, there's a whole universe of things which one could imagine that Russia could be doing but isn't doing, not because it can't or doesn't want to, but the imagination is literally unlimited in terms of the number of things that one could say that Russia should be doing in Serbia. And so opposition.
That's like people always say, ask me questions about, well, why didn't Trump do this? Or why didn't someone do something? That's really hard to say.
Right.
Because there's an infinite amount of options that something could be done at some time. I would say more the reverse question of why did something happen now is a little bit more easier to guess about or conjecture. But then again, internal motivations of people are impossible to prove. But let me take a jump here from the street view to something maybe more the official line. Because during the Cold War, I think the dynamic for foreign policy was extremely different between Russia and America. Now, basically, you had side A and side B, and they were trying to woo basically every country on Earth and divide, and try to get as much of the world as they possibly could until they got the enough to knock out the other guy. Now, this whole thing about multipolarity, and what that means is that now the nature of the international relations conflict between America and Russia is different, because the United States, trying to sort of control the entire globe, has to make sure that everyone falls in line. Whereas Russia, who's trying to defend multipolarity to have not a single hegemon controlling everything, all Russia really has to do is just make sure that there are other people standing up against the big guy, even if they stand up against Russia periodically, like, for example, Turkey.
Well, it's interesting.
Do you agree?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. It seems to me that that in American or Western media, and I think what I would call public analysis, which is not the same thing, hopefully, from what American policymakers really think. But if you were to peruse any number of, let's say, items from the Brookings Institute or from Foreign Policy Magazine, you would find a real big problem in the way that they understand or claim to understand the world, that it is Russia that it is trying to control the world. And that's totally absurd, looking at questions of economy and force projection. I mean, it's not that Russia doesn't have nuclear weapons, but their conventional standing army is very clearly based in the doctrine of defense, and that's how they have historically used their military. And given the constraints of the global economy, it looks like Russians have a lot of realism in their foreign policy, and they can really see that there's a big world, and it includes very big players like India and China, Latin America increasingly becoming a single bloc. Of course, you have the European Union, or Western Europe, if you will. The Middle East is looks like starting to turn the corner and begin to organize and develop a little bit of unity, at least in terms of getting this ISIS matter solved and getting American policy out of the region. So I think that all that together, it's just not realistic that Russia thinks that it's trying to replace the United States as a global hegemon. It looks like they've probably pretty accurately assessed that the way things are going, that the present trend of multipolarity is probably more like what we'll be developing over the next 10 and 30 years.
Well, yeah, if you're talking about the Western media, I think that's maybe a matter of projection, where they're just trying to say, well, we're trying to do that, so we're going to say you
It's
are.
like gaslighting, right?
Because it's really not particularly possible for Russia to even do that. Let's just say also, there's, I think due to Hollywood, there's this sort of perception of war and claiming of territory and the way the world works that's really, really distant from the reality of things. Like, let's just say the entire Warsaw Pact tomorrow, for some reason, just got invaded by Russia. NATO didn't do anything, and Russia came in. It would be so damaging to the Russian economy, because that territory isn't exactly going to bring in oil or gas or whatever. It's going to bring in a lot of people who need a lot of infrastructure and a lot of money from the core of Russia. It might actually work in the opposite way. Furthermore, you take territory, you build resentment. So not only would there be that, but a whole, I would definitely guess that Poland would be very reinvigorated as a nation if that were to happen. So it's this very naive idea that war, especially in the media, war is always guys and tanks who go in and take territory, and the locals don't really seem to have any say in it or reaction to it at all. And that's not the way the 21st century is working out.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a question now of, you have soft power, and we live in a fourth generational warfare paradigm of a holographic reality, which is being constructed through peer-to-peer social networks, and it's really, in many ways, it's as convincing as television was for many people. The difference with the internet and peer-to-peer and social networking and the holographic reality that it creates is that it's even more convincing for people who might otherwise be more intelligent. So I think it goes even deeper into the crevices of consciousness and creates a virtual reality that is far beyond what radio and television and film did for the second half, at least, of the 20th century. And we live in a whole different paradigm now. But something that was very interesting that you said that I wanted to follow up on and sort of bounce off of you is that now when you look at how, because you mentioned that it looks like Western media is projecting its own desires or plans onto Russia. When we say that Russia is building a multipolar world, a lot of people are confused about what that means because for most people who graduated in the West, in Western European countries or the United States, in the field of global politics or international relations, they were taught, as I was taught, globalization theory. And it was spoken of as if it was a fact and it was almost complete. And so we're actually describing something that's already happened. And this to me, and what I'm asking is, this to me seemed like a foregone conclusion. And now it looks like that's not really what's happening. So how did they manage to not only convince the world that globalization was happening, and that it was inevitable, but that in fact it had already basically been completed? What was that based in, and how did that turn out not to be the case?
One question is, who is the they in this?
Well, I'm looking at mostly the fields of international relations and geopolitics, and at the academic level, they were heavily focused on. While Fukuyama's, half serious thesis
the whole
wasn't,
Fukuyama thing. Well, my answer to that would be wishful thinking, echo chamber. Those two things, because you haven't lived here. As someone who lives here and watches the media, every year or every minor crisis, some Western journalist writes an article about how Russia's demise is soon. The sort of wishful thinking here. And even Russians make memes about how since about 2001, 2, 3, 4, around there, when Putin started to get uppity, they've been writing articles about the end of Russia's nigh, it's soon, and it just keeps going. And then you have the echo chamber factor where most quote-unquote experts in the West who discuss Russia, they really only read the same materials, only discuss Russia through the lens of the West. They generally don't speak Russian. They don't come here. Their view on Russia is completely based on the works of Solzhenitsyn, who is a clown in Russia. His works are completely rejected by everyone except urban liberal elite who despise this country. And I think they like Solzhenitsyn because he, justifies their hatred of Russia and so on. So I think that's kind of where that's coming from. But I think one thing is, again, going back to our overall question of what does Russia want, is I want to know what you think. Maybe one thing that Russia just wants is to be left alone for a while. The 20th century was pretty rough for Russia. Was it rougher on anyone else than Russia? I don't think so.
When I think about both world wars and both of them nearly destroyed Russia. It was on the nominally the winning side in the First World War, but then after subsequent to the Bolshevik Revolution, they were invaded by an alliance of some 14 different Western countries, which had previously been at war. I think that was from 1919 to 1921 1918 to 1921 or thereabouts, and This strikes me as something that doesn't get discussed a lot. And looking at the havoc that was wreaked upon Russia, I would say in the First World War, perhaps in some part due to either betrayals in the military or problems at the very top of the leadership of the country, the entanglement. Many people, especially famous founders of the field of international relations like E.H. Carr, talked about how it was the commitments, all of the complex web of alliances that these countries had concluded through the end of the 19th and first decade of the 20th century. That meant that if one country attacked the other, any of these countries attacked the other, that they were all going to be involved. And of course, it was Bismarck who believed and was very prescient when he said that such a thing would be touched off in the Balkans. And then, of course, we had the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which which was such a spark in the powder keg, as it were, and as they say, touched off that whole series of tragedies. And yes, at the same time, just to finish the point, I look at how both world wars didn't only destroy Russia, but also had tremendous damage across Europe. And I look at how the United States seemed to be conveniently involved sort of at the end of both wars, or at least in a less committed way from across the ocean. And as a result of both world wars, it seems to be somehow magical that the United States increases its global hegemony upon the ruins of Europe and Russia.
Well, yeah, I would think the main thing was that, wasn't it Woodrow Wilson who, around or after World War I, said that basically every people should have its own nation and self-determination? Well, that's a very advantageous thing to say from the standpoint of the United States, where anyone who immigrates can become an American. But, you can't just automatically become a Serb or a Frenchman or Chinese or down the line.
Right.
That was something that would definitely change the dynamic, because the world we lived in pre-World War I was a world of empires. It was a world of these multi-ethnic, powerful empires. And if you ever walk around Budapest, you can see the wealth that was generated from that, or England in general. I actually now, I don't, as an adult, as someone who's lived in Russia for a long time, you can see that this breakdown of those larger empires really hasn't been to anyone's advantage, because what's left are these tiny countries that no one cares about and are completely helpless. And whether that's by design or not, that's a little bit up to the conspiracy theorists. But if you're talking about America having a geopolitical advantage over Russia, America will always have much, 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 much better geography than Russia could ever dream of. Russia has it very rough in the geography department.
In terms of having China to its south and Europe to its west.
Well, yeah. Well, let's just think about it. I mean, who was the greatest army of the 20th century, most terrifying? Nazi Germany attacked Russia. Okay, so then we go back to the 19th century. The Grande Armée from France, the most terrifying army, attacked Russia. Also, the Swedes, when they were at their height, they attacked Russia. The Mongols at their height came in from the other side, attacked Russia. So there are so many different cultures surrounding Russia that when every dog has his day, they always have the opportunity to attack Russia. You know what I mean? So it's really, maybe the only advantage Russia has is it has the Arctic to the north. So there sort of is a... one side of the country is at least automatically defended by the fact that polar bears are not going to pick up arms.
And then they have the Pacific Ocean, I suppose.
To a degree. And also that really depends what you believe in conspiracy theories, because within Russia there's always this, the Chinese have taken over Siberia, and they haven't. The borders are actually well secured, but it's definitely a weak side. The government here understands this, because thankfully after the Soviet Union fell, geopolitics has become legal again to study, and the government understands this, is doing everything they can to get people to move out east. In fact, on the heels of building that big bridge that they built from the Crimea to mainland Russia, to help out the economy in the Crimea, who's otherwise isolated as a peninsula that's attached to Ukraine. Also on the island of Sakhalin, which is the island that's above Japan, the big one, they're actually building a bridge of that type to connect the island to the mainland, just to make sure, that prices go down, because actually their prices are very high because they have to import everything. And I've been there, and in the stores, sometimes you see a lot more stuff from Korea and Japan than you do from Russia proper. So I think they want to make sure that Sakhalin and Vladivostok and Khabarovsk and all those out there are definitely remain very, very Russian and very, very unisolated from the rest of the country.
Well, something that we see a lot is that in American press, you mentioned wishful thinking, and it would seem to me that one of the areas of wishful thinking that we hear about, and really seems to actually fall in line with a component of Trump's professed policy, is to have a tension between Russia and China. And of course, in the line of this idea, I won't call it a theory, because I think theories are normally a little bit better fleshed out. But this idea is that China's population is so great, this entire eastern area of the Russian Federation, from Siberia onwards to the Pacific, is basically unpopulated. And as a result, China can solve their own demographic issues and continue to have an unchecked population issue. Not that it's unchecked, but that they're going to grow, and that they're going to want to take the territory from the Russian Federation. And it made me think of not only that this was something which now American so-called analysis, or if you read The Economist or again Foreign Policy or Brookings Institute, they're trying to promote this idea that somehow Russia and China have a very, very serious tension, and that they have a growing enmity or a resource competition. And I wonder your thoughts now when we look at the Belt and Road project, or One Belt, One Road, which Russia and China are both involved in. Would this seem to cut against that thinking that that these are countries that would...
I would say it's not a resource conflict, it's a resource symbiosis.
Right.
One thing before I jump into that symbiosis, China actually, their population is slated to go down. They are sort of jumping into the liberal age, and people cannot have as many kids as they did in the past. And they were forbidden for having multiple kids for a long time. So the Chinese government has that well in hand, and I think they're going to stay stable at 1 billion.
Right.
Furthermore, they still have a lot of territory to go, and they actually have a housing excess, if you can believe that, although the quality of that housing in these so-called ghost towns where it's built may be undesirable. But despite China's massive population, they got plenty of places to live. But the one thing is that I believe it was Zhirinovsky, the leader of the LDPR party in Russia, said that I think China's going to be the factory and we're going to be the army. I forget. I wish I could... put this conversation on pause and look up.
No, that's about. You're paraphrasing pretty closely. I know what you're referring to, right?
Yeah. So basically, what Russia has is the military might. Despite China's size and economy, Russia still has way more military might. Russians are good at fighting. I've lived here. I fought a couple of them. It's true. But in general, there's certain things that Russia can offer: resources, the ability to fight. Also maybe access to Western markets, especially like you're talking about the whole these various different roads and Silk Roads. Russia can offer China the best thing ever, an extremely well-defended, stable means by which they can export their goods to the West and sometimes maybe even to sort of the Middle East, depending. Because as we know, well, maybe we don't know, who knows what our listeners know and don't know, the sea around China, well, there's a lot of American warships out there, just in case. And if the worst came to worst, the United States or NATO or whoever, whatever you want to call them, they could really put the squeeze on China by making it impossible to get all their boats out to ship things, because one of the reasons why China has the massive successful economy it has, well, they have the concentrated population, that's one thing, the work ethic, that's another, but also the cost of shipping has drastically gone down over time. Putting a big boat filled to the brim with tons of cheap stuff to send to Walmart, within the last few decades, that has gone down way, way, way in price. And that's part of the miracle of the Chinese economy. And people in power in Western countries understand that, and they know they could choke out the Chinese by choking out their ability to send those boats around the world.
Essentially a naval blockade. And so...
Sorry, I was kind of prattling on there, but yes, naval blockade. There you go, 2 words.
and so it seems to me that a lot of the thinking might be, as you said, wishful thinking in terms of that China and Russia are headed on a collision course. But I think a lot of people are also very curious. Another thing that we've heard coming from disinformation agents and channels in the West is that it is Russia that is interested in creating, we're talking about Russia's foreign policy interests in this episode, of course. Now we're looking at their interests towards Europe. And we hear a lot of misinformation and disinformation coming from primarily American, let's say, pseudo-journalism and analytic sources, trying to say that the Russian Federation has a material interest in stoking destabilizing politics in the European Union. And how I want to set this question up is that when I look at the European Union, and when I look at, referring back to the first part of our conversation about the travesty of the 20th century, it seems to me that it was chaos in Europe, sort of a black hole of destabilizing warring states in Europe that sort of opened up, and into this vector, into this wormhole was pulled Russia. So it would seem to me that Russian strategists and Russian planners would be keenly aware and aware of the fact that destabilization in Europe necessarily, at least by the historical record, leads towards a destabilized scenario that draws Russia into it. Your thoughts on that?
A destabilized situation. I'm thinking that's more World War I, because World War II was a much more conscious effort. Hitler knew what he was doing. He knew where he was going. He knew where he was heading. That was clear. Maybe World War I only fits that destabilization model. I'm not sure. Here's one where I might get in trouble for saying this as a foreigner in Russia, but I do think that I don't think that Russia is that actively trying to destabilize Europe. But would destabilization benefit Russia? I would say yes, because the status quo in Europe is extremely beyond pro-Washington. I mean, complete submission to Washington or submission to Brussels, which submits to Washington. So in a lot of ways, Europe is not particularly independent, but more independent countries in Europe would have the freedom to say, choose their destiny and work with Russia. As we've seen from the sanctions, what's happened with those, I believe it was even Foreign Minister Lavrov who said that a lot of times after they do the sanctions, the dignitaries that he talks with from the European Union, they'll actually go up to him and go, "Yeah, we're sorry about that. So we didn't want to, but we kind of have to, and we kind of have to." And well, that's the thing. These countries don't really get to make the decisions that they want. As we've seen in France and Poland, have been very hurt by the sanctions, which are not good for their agricultural industry. Good for Russia's, bad for theirs. But why do they have to do that? Because Russia something maybe minor did in Ukraine? Who cares? You see what I mean?
I do see.
But anyways, going back to going back to destabilization, basically, if Europe was destabilized, it would be able to break the status quo, which could serve Russian interests, maybe. So I could see why it's in Russia's interests, but there's really no evidence that Russia's able to do it, because
what do you mean
Russia
by destabilization?
has a lot of problems. Wait, one thing. Russia has a lot of problems within itself. So many problems that it's really hard to consider Russia any sort of superpower.
But what do you mean? But what do you mean by destabilization? Because when I'm talking about destabilization, I'm not talking about Eurosceptic movements, and I'll offer my theory about that. But
the Yellow Vest protests, they're something, because they've gotten so big and so active that they really, if the media was on their side, we'd already have a color revolution. But the media is not on their side. But the Color Vests are obviously, it's a very large interconnected network of various different groups are all working together. Maybe there's some Russian influence in there. I don't know. But if Russia was able to project its power, some sort of media power too, in the same way that Washington can, then France would already have become Le Pen's personal empire or something.
Sounds to me that you're saying that Russia would support some big political changes in the European Union, but I think that destabilization, I look at the situation in Ukraine or Libya that result in failed states with roving warlords and resource protection based militias and the breakdown of
Joaquin, look at it this way. If Moscow was as powerful as Washington and countries around it started to destabilize, that means they could be brought back home. If Russia wasn't as full of infiltrators and traitors and didn't have such a weak economy, when the Ukrainian crisis happened, a lot of Ukraine, the pro-Russian part of Ukraine, could have returned home en masse, and it didn't.
So, but given that Russia's divided pillars of power and the strength. I mean, really, in many ways, it seems that it's just Putin, Lavrov, Shoigu holding it together, with Medvedev running a kind of a fake liberal interference that kind of vacillates, and that everyone else is actually completely post-Andropov bought in and are trying to invest in their own individual oligarchic integration into Switzerland and the City of London. Now, and of course, so therefore they don't want Russia to be attacked, but they're not particularly loyal to Russian people or to Russian territorial integrity, because this is a separate issue from their finances, which of course they can integrate into the so-called global economy and have investments around the world, irrespective of the outcome of people who hold passports of a once country called Russia, looking into a sort of gloom future. But I think that when we look at the issue of destabilization, the reason that I don't think that Russia is promoting destabilization in Europe is precisely for the reason that you said, that it is too weak. It couldn't even monopolize on destabilization in Ukraine. And as you said, if it were in a better position, that it would have been able to. And I think it's precisely because they have accurately measured their present condition I'm talking about destabilization in the European Union. Well, here's what I would offer, because I said that I would. So I think that the Russia promoting Euroskeptic movements has a multi-layered policy, a multi-layered long-term cause and effect plan. So I think that, of course, the first stage is that you can manipulate the fact that the United States has been able to manipulate the European Union precisely because individual European countries actually have a lot more autonomy than they would if Europe was a more centralized single nation state. And then, so that Eurosceptic movements have to be used by Russia in the interim to take advantage of the relative confederal status of the European Union compared to the 50 states of the United States, for example. And then that is going to push, in particular, Berlin and Paris to do things like, we need to form a European army.
You mentioned Berlin, so here we're going to go into other people's theories. This isn't my personal theory, but I've heard from a lot of Russian experts, especially in the geopolitical realm, that basically, before World War I, there was a very strong belief that there's never going to be this war with Germany. We're going to be buddies with Germany. They're basically going to take over everything west of their country, be this continental European dominating force, and then there's going to be peace, because at the time they thought that there would always be peace between Russians and Germans because they're so similar and they had so many interminglings between the aristocracy. Obviously that didn't happen, but going back, there is an idea now that if Germany was sort of free from the yoke, because remember, one of the main missions of NATO is to make sure Germany never rises again. It's to keep Russia down, but keep Germany completely down. And there's this desire, or maybe fantasy, that if Germany was to be free of its bonds, that it may rise, and that it would be a country that with whom they could be basically dealt with.
Right, but that's a NATO question.
Yeah.
So,
not so much an EU. No. Again, yeah, you're totally right. If France became totally destabilized by Russia, they would gain nothing from it, because a new group of people would come in. They wouldn't be loyal to Russia whatsoever, and everything would just go around. The real, I guess, enemy of Russia would be Brussels, not Paris or Berlin or whoever.
Because while I support most Eurosceptic movements in principle. But the principle being the foundation of the European Union as premised upon finance capitalism and a speculative economy, and the endless printing of a fiat currency and the inflationary cycle, and as well the ideology, which is an anti-European ideology, and one which can give a lot of people some pretty decent evidence for even the most wild conspiracy theories that some elites might even not care that some
Well, yeah,
population
Joaquin,
replacement is going on.
there's a difference between strategy and maybe let's call it morality, because let's just say there's a different world map and Russia takes a big jump and is located next to New Zealand. It's no longer a factor in Europe. The European Union, despite maybe biases I have from living in Russia, the European Union is absolutely horrible for the Europeans because, like you said, it's anti-European. It has the forced multiculturalism, the native population replacement. It is on the pathway to self-destruction and is basically, in a way, as racist to itself as, say, the Nazis were racist to others. If that makes sense. It's
Yeah,
sort of like
right.
inverted fascism. And obviously that's horrible. And that's from the moral side, not from a Russia strategy, Russia good, bad, or whatever. That's a separate issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's being promoted in pop music, in literature, in academia, in all the realms of coordinated culture and society in Europe. I remember I visited Italy often, and I was there, and we're getting ready for dinner, and sort of in the hotel room watching music videos. And there was this performer named Jovanotti, and he's like this liberal hippie guy, and he's just all over the magazines. It's like this obvious campaign. He's a product, and it was just so the levels of inauthenticity and dishonesty in his product. He's like a hippie with like long hair and wears goofy outfits, and he's all about peace and love. And if you actually listen to the words and the presentation of one of his hit songs, it escapes me because it's so forgettable. That they're saying, that they're against all these things and that are fundamentally European, and they make it sound like that's in the direction of peace and justice and freedom.
No.
And then there was a very strange key line and I want this for you, even if you don't want it for you. And it was like, wow, that's actually the inverted fascism that you're talking about.
Yeah. Because that's the thing is there's this bizarre reasoning that because the Nazis love themselves too much, now you should hate yourself. No, you should have a rational view of yourself. No Indian person should hate themselves for being Indian. No Chinese person should hate themselves for being Chinese. No African for being African, and so on down the line. That's but it's a balance. You shouldn't be like
chauvinistic,
African,
right?
You shouldn't be an African nationalist who wants to kill everyone, but you should never feel shame for being African. You should, have a reasonable view of your own culture. You have your pluses, your minuses. And as someone who's born in America, America has its pluses and minuses. And when you live in Russia, a country that does not have any can-do attitude, you just want to say USA, USA, USA chants all day long, because that's one thing that's amazing about America. You have this awesome can-do attitude. But when you want to talk to a lot of people in America about anything besides the weather or football, can be a little rough.
Right. No, it's a different culture. It's a different culture. I know that Serbs have a little bit of a different temperament than Russians because it's a bit more of a Mediterranean people and get fired up in a different way and become passionate in a different way. So even though they're Slavs, I guess, because the language group, and there's of course a lot of the similar R1 markers overlap, but a lot of them don't. And we have a lot of different blood here and a different cultural inheritance as well. And it's maybe a little bit more like Italy in some ways, but there's definitely this idea of that some big project can wait until tomorrow, or that it's impossible. So I think that when we think about ourselves as coming from the United States, we grew up with books like The Go-Getter, and we grew up in a sort of a cultural environment of pull yourself up by the bootstrap, or anything is possible if you dream big enough, or build it and they will come. And I have found that lacking, and I'm not sure that it's a problem on the balance because of what it comes with, like you said, the pluses and the minuses. But I have found it quite difficult to get people to understand that very basic entrepreneurial spirit of taking a risk.
How many times? Sorry, I'm kind of breaking a kayfabe, as they would call it here. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say dude in a professional podcast. But listen, do you know how many times I've tried to explain the concept of build it and they will come to people in Russia? That the concept of something like that, of potential, seeing potential in things, non-existent.
Yeah.
Because the thing is I don't want, we're talking here, and of course, from a sort of geopolitical standpoint, we're both on the side of multipolarity, right? But that doesn't mean we're anti-American. There's
Right.
so much that's awesome about America. What isn't awesome is the Washington trying to dominate the world and do things like they're doing with Europe, where now we all have to hate each other, population replacement, forced immigration, so that way I guess the whole world can become some sort of giant mixed up America, and all cultures die except for liberalism. That's what I'm against. There's so much that's right about America. The problem is it gets sort of overshadowed. And one thing that the Russians don't do is the things that are right about Russia, they are not able to promote or market or package, because the American way of life is well packaged, well understood. Well, it's at least, I don't know, well understood. It's well sold to foreign people, but a Russian way of doing things yet remains sadly locked away within Russia.
Yeah, what I've noticed in my dealings with Russians is that well, I would say that in the United States, that corruption happens at the very, very highest level, right? I would say that in the United States, that the deep state itself and the financial industry and the bank controls the White House, and they print money and create artificial economic crises to further, let's say, increase the velocity of the upwards concentration or upwards redistribution of wealth into ever fewer hands. But at the regular everyday functioning of most businesses or most, let's say, government bureaucracies, there's very little corruption. And whereas in Russia, it seems that it's the opposite. It seems that you have a small group of people at the very top that seem to, be coming out of some hermetically sealed deep state KGB type thing that just kind of barely trying to kind of hold together some of the remnants of the stability of the Soviet Union at the very, very top. And then everyone else is corrupt, and you have the whole middle bureaucracy is corrupt, and the whole media institution is corrupt in Russia.
Yeah. Not just corrupt, but infiltrated.
That's
infiltrated
is probably a better way to put it. Yeah.
Basically, that's one thing. As someone who's had the chance to be around a lot of important people, I won't say who's who because I could get in real trouble.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I've been around a lot of important people.
Yeah.
All right, and people from different sectors: media, finance, industry. They hate this place.
Right.
They hate these people. They have nothing to do with it. They don't understand it. The sad reality is the majority of the people who are in some sort of position of power are not the people who should be there. And it's something like, by the grace of God, that there are a few people at the very tip top of the deal who actually do care about this place, and it's really only their personal willpower that's kind of keeping the boat afloat. But
is that endemic in the history of Russia? Is that a pattern in Russian history?
If we were to read Dugin's books, yes. Because he sees a sort of overarching theory that in Russian society the Tsar has always been the good guy. He's sort of been on the side of Russia. He understands the meaning of it. He's sort of our sort of saint, right? And then you have the masses who are sort of, well, they're the masses, but they're also loyal to Russia. So you have the Tsar and the masses which are loyal, whereas in, say, medieval France, the clergy and the nobility sort of just want to always gang up on the peasantry, right? But in Russia, the elite is always evil. There's something where, with Russians and their concept of equality, as soon as some Russian gets that ability to feel better than everyone else, there's something that's very addictive to that. Like if some Russian guy gets that opportunity to steal that money and get that Volvo or BMW or Audi to feel different and better than everyone, he'll jump it, and jump on it. And that's one thing that even happened in communism, was despite the fact there was a lot of equality, whoever worked at the Ministry of Trade or whatever, who could get those wonderful boots from Czechoslovakia, they'd always wear those boots around just to feel better than everyone else. And so Russians have this sort of collectivist society, but at the same time, this sort of inner desire to break away from that and break free of it and be better than everyone else. Like in America, we are very regimented by rules. Americans love rules. And I think that's why in all of our Hollywood fantasies, everyone tells their boss to go F himself or break the rules, or some 80s cop, he's willing to risk his whole career
Serpico,
by going against orders. Because in our society, in America, if something's written on a piece of paper, you do it. That's something Russians don't understand.
Right.
Because if something's written on a piece of paper, rules here are a suggestion.
Yeah.
In America, they're rules.
Yeah, I picked up on that. I found it difficult overall, and I wondered if this was a suitable climate for business. A lot of people seem non-agreement capable, or there seem to be a lot of sort of peasant tricks, like do the work first and then we'll see if we can pay you. And coming from a country where things are pretty transparent and there's a contract, you better read the fine print in America, or you could end up pretty screwed over. But there is a contract, and people normally fulfill both ends of it, but it's in writing. And something I found very interesting in Russia is a lot of things are just cash and handled in a very strange way. But that's not to disparage the Russians, because I think, like you said at the top of this, we're talking about the pluses and minuses in every society. And I think that there's a reason that you live in the Russian Federation and not in the United States, and those have to be some pretty good ones. I know I could list at least a dozen or two reasons that I'm in Serbia and not the United States, and I probably making less than a tenth than I did in the United States. Of course, there's a relative economy here which makes that possible, but not that possible. So I know there's a lot of things that I've seen that are just more worthwhile than money, like being in a place that has a soul. And I think that sort of reducing the human experience to the sort of homo economicus is part of the Western problem. And so I find myself torn, because at the one hand, there's this lack of this understanding of build it and they will come, or this idea of the go-getter. But on the other hand, there's sort of an attention to things that count maybe a little bit more, like Grandpa's sick, so let's go visit him. It's really unheard of to put people in an old folks home here, whereas in the United States it's like the practice. So these are very big differences.
Well, I don't mean to toot my own horn, but speaking from my own perspective, one thing I'm sort of known for here is when I came to Russia, it was still in the 1990s humiliation mode. And I was one of the people, through doing a lot of YouTube videos and being on every possible TV show and so on, I sort of used the wacky foreign guy persona as a way to get in there and tell people, like, look.
Wait, you were like the reverse Yakov Smirnov, or?
I don't know those, because Yakov Smirnov just sort of crapped on Russia while he was in America. That's not a fair comparison, because I didn't just go around crapping on the United States.
Fair enough.
But I would say that what I was able to do is usher in the era we're in now, especially in the media, where in the past, the 90s, like, it was almost that way, that like SJW masturbatory self-hatred. And then myself, other people who were able to sort of get in the media. Now, like I said, Russia's completely infiltrated, dominated by many liberals. They hate this country, but you can't say it publicly. These liberals have to put on that smile and celebrate Victory Day and celebrate Easter, even though they hate it, and do patriotic projects that they hate. And that's one of the problems why anything that's like a patriotic movie here usually sucks, because it's made by people who hate this country and hate the patriotism for it. But still, now they've been sort of like relegated to the shadows, but they're still there. And I was kind of like a part of that. So, but I just want to say that my life then here has a lot of meaning. In the United States, maybe my life would have had meaning, but I think my destiny was to move ventilation and gas cans around, which is sort of what I did for a while. I think that's about all I was destined to do in the United States. But meaning, coming here and finding meaning is something that I definitely did do. And in a lot of ways, there's a lot of things here that, well, doing business here is a nightmare. It is a nightmare. But day-to-day life is really nice.
So when I look at Russian foreign policy on Europe, then when I look at how different the Western European mindset is, it's a little bit, the European mindset is different, is distinct from both the American and the Russian mindset. But it seems that Russia's support, or at times tacit or touch and go support for various Eurosceptic movements, would seem to compel. What I want to say is that in reality, what the engine of the European Union is Germany's ability to muscle with France to engage in global, let's say global or global market campaigns to get their products out there, and then to engage at times, especially when America has a more trilateral or at least bilateral foreign policy, typically not neoconservative policy, and involves Europe in their colonial and imperialist adventures. And then you get, Peugeot and the big concerns and combines, Daimler, Mercedes, and so forth, involved. And then, of course, the European banking houses also benefit when they team up with America to, let's say, do something in Africa or do something in the Middle East. So it seems to me that despite those cultural differences, that they're able to maintain this transatlantic alliance, that when Russia, but it seems that it is actually the relative decentralization of Europe, and that so many things happen at the level of the European Parliament, and that it allows German Euroscepticism. What I want to say is that German Euroscepticism is probably at the opposite end of reality from Irish Euroscepticism. And what I mean by that is that when you really get to the bottom of it, it's not that Brussels controls Germany, it's that Brussels is a vehicle by which two things happen. Germany doesn't appear to be Brussels, and then secondly, transatlantic interests can manipulate the fact that in fact the European Union is not as centralized as the United States, and so it can press upon the various economic concerns that are governed by nominally sovereign European states to get certain results at the level of the European Council and the European Parliament, right? So they can have tremendous impact on the Troika, let's say, without Germany taking responsibility. But what I want to say, Tim, is that if Germany and France were to become stronger partners in a more centralized European Union, but it couldn't be one based in a victimological or guilt over World War II framework, you see. But if they were to become stronger partners, then Russia would actually have someone that was agreement capable. They would have a single partner, let's say a Paris-Berlin axis, with which that they could actually make concrete agreements and not have all this interference at the level of the EU.
If what you're saying is that the European Union had sort of a different format where it was actually a European union and had a more realistic layout in terms of understanding the way the organization. I'm explaining this badly, but basically, Brussels is in a tiny, tiny, weak Belgium. Okay, it's a tiny, pathetic country that can't do anything on its own. It's not the real leader,
right?
Because if you especially look at sort of the what is it, the blue corridor that goes down from London between Paris and Berlin, where Brussels actually is, and then down to Italy. Yeah, that is the core of the European Union, and it is kind of there. But really, I think it's the German economy that's the one that really is gonna push that horse down the line, especially if England, for some reason, actually does leave, which I think that they'll just eventually keep kicking the can down the road and not leave. But I can kind of see what you're saying, but the thing is, that's very wishful thinking to think that the European Union is just going to one day stand up and have a very different attitude towards itself. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
You mean you mean coming from within itself?
Yes.
But I mean, when you really look at what's very interesting about Eurosceptic movements, I'm trying to point out a lot of contradictions and a lot of positions that don't really necessarily fit together that comprise the various Euroscepticisms.
Well, you can be Euroskeptic for various different
Right.
reasons. You could be some sort of like anarcho-capitalist guy who's just like, hey, I want to live on a Scottish island and we're going to be this little community and don't force us to do things, man. You could be that, or you could be someone who's some sort of nationalist who's like, we have open borders, this is a nightmare. Those two people may, on that particular issue, agree, but they may very, very radically disagree about everything else.
But
So
don't
that's,
Eurosceptic movements isn't this sort of part of a dialectic or a dialogue or a process? I mean, isn't it all happening? It's all happening within Europe and the physical economy of Europe, and the roads and the highways and the trains and the interdependence on the production of different parts necessary for assembly for various goods that occur in different countries, and the shipping routes and the times that the trains run and the trucks between, and the economy and the employment structures are really point to an integrated Europe. And it would seem to me that that an integrated Europe has been a sort of a necessary outcome of the development of the physical economy. I mean, in other words, if the Silk Road or these various whatever Belt and Road type projects under various names and marketing ploys,
here's something. Are you just trying to say that if the European Union have never formed, everything maybe stayed the way it was, that pretty much the results would still be the same?
They'd be about the same. But it seems that like the European Union is a stillborn project, and therefore has like all these contradictions, and that Eurosceptic positions are, like as you said, come from all kinds of different directions. Not as if the Europe. I think that my view of history is that I'm don't find a lot of utility in the construction of counterfactual histories, because it always begs the question of why things happen the way they did. And there's never, one guy got assassinated. I mean, there's always, well, then why was that guy, a member of the Order of the Black Hand? And why was this guy, what was, right? So every time you answer a question, it begs the next question. So my view of history is that the way it happened is the only way that it could have happened, but it seems that looking forward is what I'm always interested in. So as an analyst, I'm always tried, because people want to ask me what's going to happen next, and I don't think that people really fully have a clear picture of what's already happened and why. And I think that once
and also I always say, as someone who works in analysis, it's much easier to exclude things. I can definitely tell you what won't happen.
Right.
That's for sure.
Right.
That's
it's easier to
step.
exclude things than to list all the possible things that could happen.
Yeah, because especially people be like, well, what if Trump just changes his mind and starts liking Russia? Like, because a lot of people view politics from this interpersonal, emotional standpoint,
that's right.
Which is absolutely the worst way to view politics. So that's the first thing. It's always just say, it's not about emotions. It's not about feelings. It's not about liking each other. It's not that America likes you or doesn't like you. That doesn't matter. It's geopolitics. It's economics. It's realism in international relations and so on. But anyways, yeah, that's different. But I was want to go back a little bit to that whole European Union thing, where if the European Union never happened, maybe even if World War II never happened, would there be a border between France and Germany that forces people to stop there? I don't know. Maybe the border would be open if the French and the Germans were both completely sure that they don't let the whole world come into their countries, and who the hell knows who's crossing the border. Maybe that could happen. Because there is no, there is the Eurasian Economic Union, but that's very weak and very just starting, but there's no border between Belarus and Russia anymore.
Well, so what happened in the history of the European Union is that it was a project that various elements of all the civil society were infiltrated and co-opted to get on board with. And because of some degree of economic illiteracy among the left, particular what is now the component parts of the European Trade Union Council, but in the past there were of course national sections of different labor unions, automakers, steel workers, oil, petroleum, truckers, train engineers, and so forth. That there was no real advantage or particular reason to support the European Union until there was a campaign to change the leadership by organizing fake or astroturf rank and file campaigns to really change the leadership of the labor unions. And then so what happened in 1999 when the euro was rolled out, and suddenly people's lira and pesetas, especially in the peripheral EU countries, well, what happened in essence is that overnight their currencies were halved in spending power, right?
That happened in Russia a while ago. I remember to this day. But I think we're getting a little off topic, and we're at the hour mark. So let's maybe make our final summation here. Tim Kirby from the Center for Syncretic Studies, my opinion is that what Russia really wants is just a few things. Some big things. A multipolar world order, the stability in order to grow naturally and planned growth as well, and to reintegrate some of its former territory through peaceful means, preferably peaceful means, back to the central core, and to grow and become a respected, powerful pole in a multipolar world.
All right, here are my closing thoughts then. I would agree about Russia's objectives in terms of its own internal development, and I also think that they'd like to pick up former parts of the Soviet Union as well, and I think that they at times show that a stronger inclination to do that than others. Of course, it has to do really as much to do with infiltration inside of Russia's own pillars of power as it does transatlantic conspiracies of all kinds. And I would agree with that point wholeheartedly. I would also agree with your prior iteration of the point that China and Russia are not at odds, and that is a generally unthought out idea that is more like wishful thinking, I think you would say. And also where I would disagree or would phrase it differently is I would say that Russia does not favor destabilization in Europe, but is engaged in a cause and effect scenario where they are showing the European Union that either or both the U.S. And or Russia can act upon the manipulating the levers of what is actually quite of two things happening in Europe. And to summarize, and I guess I'll say it in 20 seconds, is basically that Europe's, let's say, for lack of a better word, liberal social policies on a number of issues ranging from the meaning of life and consumerism to border and immigration issues, in combination with its decentralization, has made them both weak, impossible to plan socially and economically, and also really non-agreement capable, because what I think Moscow, who they really want to talk to, is Paris and Berlin, and have all the other countries sort of be a little bit more in line. Now, I'm not speaking that in terms of that's what I think is what is the most just thing in the eyes of let's say different nationalists who believe that this is the way that all these countries should be different. I think that might be a little bit of idealism to think that Europe is not a single community. My big, let's say, gripe or beef with the organization of the European Union is that it is frameworked in an overtly financed and individually, privately owned capitalist, crony capitalist style of economy, in combination with these entangleable transatlantic obligations, which are frustrated furthermore and made even worse by its relatively decentralized nature.
To put it short, does Russia want a Europe that it can work with? Yes, very much so. And I think that's the end of our first episode. So for everyone here who listened and watched to the end, thank you very much. And let us know in the comments maybe what you'd like us to discuss in the future. Maybe there's some other personalities at the Center for Syncretic Studies that you'd like to get to know or meet. We'd be happy to have them on here. And let us know at all if this is an interesting format for you. If you liked it, if you like long-form discussion, we'd be happy to discuss things in the future. Anyways, I'm Tim Kirby saying goodbye, and with me was
Joaquin Flores, and I bid you all a good evening and good night.